people who were friends with the killers. What were your first thoughts after you found out what they did? Have you noticed anything strange about their behavior before? Answer 1. I still can't believe this happened. One of my close friends, whom I had known for many years, turned out to be a murderer. We met at university. He was the guy who was always fun to be with. He always smiled, always supported the company, and sometimes he could get out of the most difficult situation with a joke or some unexpected act. He was the life and soul of our little party, and it seemed to me that we knew each other inside out. But then something happened that turned my life upside down. One morning, I woke up to a bunch of messages and calls. Everyone wanted to know what I thought about what happened. I didn't understand anything until I opened news sites. It turned out that he was arrested for murder, and more than one. I couldn't believe it. This guy I went on hikes with, who I invited to my family reunions, turned out to be a monster I never knew existed. When I began to analyze his behavior, I remembered moments when he became strange. There were times when he suddenly became silent at parties and became too withdrawn. Sometimes I noticed how he looked intently at someone, and his gaze was somehow empty, almost gloomy. But I chalked it up to stress or fatigue. I never would have thought that this could be a signal of what he was capable of. Answer 2. I grew up in the same area as him. We have been inseparable friends since childhood. We went to the same school, hung out together, even tried our first cigarettes on the same day. He was always my best friend, and I couldn't imagine my life without him. He was the person I could always rely on. But then one day I received a call from my mom, who told me in tears that he had been arrested for murder. I couldn't believe it. This man, whom I thought was my brother, turned out to be someone completely different. At that moment, I felt that my world had collapsed. After the shock had passed a little, I began to remember all the moments that now seemed suspicious to me. For example, his unexpected aggression in controversial situations, which seemed inappropriate, or the way he sometimes froze in conversation and his gaze became somehow cold, as if he was thinking about something completely alien. But I never attached any importance to this, because this was my friend, and I could not even imagine that he was capable of something so terrible. Answer 3. When I found out that my housemate, with whom I had lived side by side for 3 years, turned out to be a murderer, I was in a state of shock. This man always seemed kind and calm to me, although a little distant. We weren't close friends, but I always treated him with respect. He never caused problems. He was always polite and friendly. But as soon as I learned the truth, all the little things that I had not previously noticed suddenly surfaced in my memory and took on new meaning. For example, his habit of going outside in the middle of the night and just standing there, staring into space, or his strange obsession with cleanliness, which bordered on paranoia. He washed his hands often, as if he were trying to wash away something more than just dirt. Now, when I look back, it creeps me out to think that I lived next to this man and did not suspect anything. He was always quiet, and I thought he was just withdrawn. But now I understand that behind this calmness, there was something much darker. Answer 4. I knew him for many years, since we started working in the same company. We were not just colleagues, but also good friends. He often came to visit me. We went fishing together, shared personal problems with each other. He was the kind of person you could rely on, and I always thought I knew him inside out. But one morning when I came to work, everyone around me was whispering and discussing something terrible. It turned out that he was arrested for murder. At first I decided that this was some kind of mistake, because my friend could not have done this. But the more I learned, the clearer it became that it was true. The first days I could not understand how this was even possible. Then I began to remember our conversations, his glances, which sometimes became too heavy, as if he was hiding something dark inside himself. His occasional but pointed comments about how the world is full of injustice now seemed to me to be something much more sinister than just an expression of discontent. But then I didn't attach any importance to it, because it was my friend. Answer 5. We have been neighbors and friends since childhood. He was always the guy who never got into trouble and was an example to everyone. He had a job, a family, a home, everything you could dream of. We often spent time together. Our families were friends, and I would never have thought that he was capable of this. One evening I got a call from work and said that he had been arrested for murder. It was like being hit on the head with a hammer. I didn't know how to react to it. I spent the entire evening in shock, trying to figure out what I had missed. Now that I think back on him, I begin to notice things that didn't seem strange to me before. His sudden mood swings, moments when he would withdraw into himself and become very quiet. He was never aggressive, but sometimes there was something in his behavior that now seems to me to be a sign that there was something dark inside him. I don't know how I could have missed it, but that's probably the scariest part. Realizing that there could be a person next to you capable of doing this, and you didn't notice. Answer 6. I could never imagine that the person with whom I lived under the same roof would turn out to be a murderer. He was my roommate when we were in college. We shared a room for 2 whole years, and during that time I thought I got to know him well. He was a quiet guy, a little strange, but always friendly and helpful. We weren't best friends, but we spent enough time together to consider him a friend. One day I heard the news that he had been arrested for murder. My heart sank. I just couldn't believe it. At first I thought it was a mistake because he didn't look like someone capable of violence, but then I started remembering times when he acted strangely. For example, his habit of going to the shower in the middle of the night and staying there for an hour or more, or how he sometimes stared at people on campus, and his gaze was somehow empty, as if he was looking through them. These little things, which previously seemed to me simply his personal quirks, now acquired a new, frightening meaning. I still can't come to terms with the idea that I lived next to such a person and didn't notice anything suspicious. Answer 7. I worked side by side with him for several years. He was one of those people you could always rely on. We often talked at work and sometimes spent time together after work. He was always a little introverted, but that never struck me as strange. We just thought that he was an introvert and preferred to be alone with himself. But one day news came to work that he had been arrested for murder. It was like a bolt from the blue. Everyone in the office was in shock. No one could believe that this quiet and calm person could do such a thing. At first I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mind was filled with memories of our conversations, how he sometimes became very serious and said things that seemed strange, but I did not attach any importance to them. Now I understand that these strange moments were signals that something was wrong with him. For example, he once talked about how unfair the world is and how he felt that he had to hold back so as not to do something irreversible. Then I laughed and considered it just words. But now, knowing the truth, I understand that he was a much more complex person than he seemed at first glance. Answer 8. We met at work and quickly became friends. He was the guy you could always get along with, even though he was often a little aloof. He did not like to share his personal problems and preferred to talk about work or general topics. In our team, he was respected for his professionalism and calmness. When I found out that he was arrested for murder, I was shocked. I simply could not believe that this man, whom I considered my friend, was capable of such a thing. I began to analyze his behavior and remember all the times when he seemed strange. For example, his habit of disappearing for several days without warning and returning with such an expression on his face as if he had experienced something very difficult. Now I understand that behind his outer calm lay a deep internal struggle. Sometimes there was a strange sparkle in his eyes that I had not noticed before or did not want to notice. This experience made me reconsider how little we know about the people around us. Answer 9. I knew him since childhood. We grew up together in the same area, went to the same school, and our families were friends. He was always a quiet and modest guy, never got into trouble, and was a role model. Everyone thought he was a great guy, and so did I. He was a good friend, and I trusted him like no one else. When I found out that he was arrested for murder, I was in a state of shock. I just couldn't believe that this man I'd known my whole life turned out to be a monster. I began to remember our conversations and moments that now seemed strange to me. For example, his obsession with justice and hatred of people who, in his opinion, did not deserve what they had. Now, when I look back, it scares me to think that I spent so much time with a person who could hide such dark secrets. I never thought that there could be someone so dangerous next to me. Answer 10. We met at the gym. He was one of those guys who always came to practice at the same time. We started talking, then we started going for coffee after training. He was quiet and a little reserved, but I even liked that. He didn't like loud and overly sociable people. He seemed like a good person to me, and I never thought that there might be something dark hiding behind his calmness. When I found out that he was arrested for murder, it was like a blow to the head. I couldn't believe that the person I spent so much time with could be capable of such a thing. I began to remember our conversations and moments that now seem suspicious to me. For example, his rare but strange statements about how easy it is to deceive the system, or how he sometimes feels the desire to let off steam in some harsh ways. Now it seems to me that I didn't know him at all. It's a terrible feeling when you realize that the person you thought was a friend was actually someone completely different. Answer 11. We worked together in the same office. He was the guy you could always laugh with and hang out with on a break. We often had lunch together, discussed news, and shared opinions about life. He always seemed like a normal guy to me, a little strange in his perception of the world, but I never thought that there might be something more serious hidden behind this. One day when I came to work, I learned that he had been arrested for murder. I was shocked. How could a man whom I had known for several years be capable of such a thing? I started analyzing all the times he acted strangely. For example, how he often spoke about his dissatisfaction with life and people who, in his opinion, did not deserve what they had. I thought these were just words, but now I understand that these were signs of his internal struggle. Now I shudder to think how little I knew about the man who sat next to me every day. I will never be able to trust people the same way again. Answer 12. He was my friend for many years. We met through mutual friends and became friends pretty quickly. He was the guy who was always the center of attention, always joking and laughing. We often spent time together, and I never thought that there might be something dark hidden behind his smile. When I found out that he was arrested for murder, it was like a bolt from the blue. I simply could not believe that this cheerful and friendly man was capable of such a thing. I began to remember all our meetings and conversations, and suddenly many things began to seem strange to me. For example, how he sometimes talked about how annoying people around him were, and how he felt depressed because of it. Now that I think about it, I get scared. How could I not notice anything suspicious? Maybe I just didn't want to see the truth because he was my friend. Answer 13. We met at work and immediately hit it off. He was the guy who could always cheer you up and support you. We often had lunch together, went on breaks, and discussed everything we could. He was a kind and sympathetic person, and I would never have thought that he could be dangerous. When I learned that he had been arrested for murder, I was stunned. It seemed incredible. How could someone I got along so well with do something like that? I began to remember all the little things that previously seemed insignificant to me. For example, his rare but cutting remarks about how he sometimes wants to disappear or do something drastic. Now looking back, I understand that perhaps he was already making it clear that he had problems. But I didn't notice this because I couldn't even imagine that he could be capable of such a thing. Answer 14. We lived in the same house and he was my neighbor for several years. We were not close friends, but we often crossed paths and sometimes chatted on the staircase. He always seemed a little strange to me, but I thought it was just part of his character. He was quiet, almost unnoticeable, and I never thought that something more dangerous could be hidden behind it. When I learned that he had been arrested for murder, I was shocked. It seemed completely impossible. How could a man who was always so calm commit such a crime? I began to remember times when he behaved unusually, like how he would sometimes disappear for a few days and then come back and act like nothing had happened. I now realize that his quirks could have been warning signs, but then I simply did not pay attention to it, considering him simply my person. This taught me to be more attentive to the people around me. Answer 15. He and I were friends for many years. He was my best friend and we shared everything with each other. He was always the guy you could turn to for advice or just a heart-to-heart talk. I knew him as a kind and sympathetic person who was always ready to help, but one day I found out that he was arrested for murder. It was a shock that I could not stomach. How could a man I had known for so long and considered my brother do something like that? I began to remember our conversations and moments when he seemed strange to me. For example, how he sometimes talked about how unfair the world was, and how he sometimes wanted to just give up everything. Now I understand that perhaps he was already trying to let me know that he had problems. But I didn't notice this because I couldn't even imagine that my best friend could be capable of such a thing. This was the scariest lesson of my life, to realize that you never know a person completely, Answer 16. We met in college and quickly became best friends. He was the guy who always knew how to have fun, support, or just help in difficult times. We spent almost all our free time together. Evenings, weekends, holidays. He was the kind of person I could call brother, and I always felt like I knew him inside out. But one day, several years later, I learned that he had been arrested for murder. It was like a bolt from the blue. I couldn't believe that the person with whom I had been through so much was capable of such a thing. The first few days after that were the hardest of my life. I tried to understand how I could not have noticed anything suspicious. Now, looking back, I remember moments that previously seemed just strange to me, like how he could suddenly become very silent and lost in thought, or how he sometimes avoided discussing certain topics, as if he was afraid that he might say something unnecessary. But then I didn't attach any importance to it, because I couldn't even think that he was capable of violence. This experience taught me that people can hide the darkest parts of their souls from us, even if they seem closest to us. Answer 17. We were colleagues for several years, and although we weren't best friends, I always thought he was a good guy. He was quiet, a little reserved, but always professional and friendly. We sometimes went out for lunch together, discussed work issues, and sometimes even personal issues. He seemed to me like a person who had everything going well, although sometimes I noticed something strange about him. When I learned that he had been arrested for murder, I was shocked. It just didn't fit in my head. I began to replay in my memory all our conversations and moments when he seemed strange to me. For example, his rare but very harsh statements about how the world is unfair and how he sometimes wants to get away from it all. I always thought it was just words, an expression of dissatisfaction, but now I understand that perhaps there was something more hidden behind these words. This incident made me think about how little we know about people, even if we spend a significant amount of time with them. This was a wake-up call for me, a reminder that I need to be more attentive to those around me. Answer 18. We met through mutual friends, and although we weren't particularly close, I always thought he was a good person. He was the guy who always smiled, was always in a good mood, and supported others. He was part of our company, and I never thought that there might be something dark hidden behind his smile. But one day I found out that he was arrested for murder. It was like being hit on the head with a hammer. I couldn't believe that this cheerful man was capable of such a thing. I started remembering all the times he acted strangely. For example, how he could sometimes suddenly become silent in the middle of a conversation and stare at one point, as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. Or how he sometimes said that people are not always what they seem. Now that I think about it, I feel creepy. How could I not notice anything suspicious? This experience made me reconsider my attitude towards people and what they say. Answer 19. I worked on the same team with him, and he was always the guy you could rely on. He was smart, competent, and always did his job to the highest standard. We weren't close friends, but I always respected him for his professionalism and calmness. He seemed like a man who had everything under control, and I never saw anything suspicious about him. When I found out that he was arrested for murder, I was shocked. It was completely unexpected and incomprehensible. I began to remember moments when he seemed strange to me, like how he sometimes talked about how he couldn't handle pressure, but I thought it was just stress from work, or how he would sometimes withdraw into himself and his face would become gloomy. Now I understand that these could be signs that he had problems that he did not want to talk about. This incident taught me that people can hide their darkest sides even from those who are close to them every day. I became more attentive to what people around me say and how they behave. Answer 20. We have been neighbors and friends for several years. He was always a calm and friendly person, and I never thought that something dangerous could be hidden behind his calmness. We sometimes spent time together, went fishing, talked at parties. He was the guy you could talk to about anything, and I never thought that he might be capable of anything terrible. But one day I found out that he was arrested for murder. It was like being struck by lightning. I could not believe that this man, whom I considered my friend, was capable of such a thing. I began to remember all the moments that now seemed suspicious to me, like how he would sometimes become very quiet and withdrawn, as if something was weighing on him inside, or how he sometimes talked about how people can be evil and unfair. Now, looking back, I understand that perhaps he was already trying to express his internal struggle, but I did not see it or did not want to see it. This experience has made me more aware of those around me and not ignore signs that may.